I'm Daniel Carter, and at my own brother's wedding, he stood up in front of 200 guests, raised his glass, and said maybe I didn't belong there. What he didn't know. Just hours earlier, I'd signed papers to buy this $1 million venue out from under him, and by the end of the night, he'd be getting the bill. The late summer air in Houston carried a kind of warmth that clung to your skin, the kind that made you loosen your tie even before you reached the reception hall. The Willow Estate stood at the end of a long cobblestone driveway, white columns gleaming under strings of sea golden lights. I parked near the edge of the lot, away from the lines of sleek black sedans and glossy SUVs, and sat in the car for a few seconds longer than necessary. Through the windshield, I could see the open lawn filled with guests in expensive suits and shimmering dresses, champagne flutes glinting in the fading sunlight. Somewhere beyond them, a jazz quartet played under a canopy draped in cream silk, the notes floating lazily in the air. I straightened my jacket, stepped out, and forced my face into the kind of polite half-smile people wear at family events. Inside the courtyard, the smell of roses and eucalyptus hit me. The place was flawless, every table topped with towering arrangements of white hydrangeas and soft blush peonies. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved like clockwork between guests, refilling glasses before they were even half empty. I spotted my mother near the front, talking to a cluster of relatives I barely recognized. She looked over, her expression cooling just slightly before she turned back to her conversation. Ethan stood beside her, hand resting on Sophie's lower back, his suit tailored within an inch of perfection. I made my way toward them, nodding to a few cousins on the way. Ethan noticed me first, his smile just a little too tight. Sophie's eyes flicked over my outfit, lingering for a second on the watch I wore. Then she gave me a small, almost imperceptible smirk. "Dan, glad you could make it?" Ethan said, his voice smooth but without warmth. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, keeping my tone even. My mother's greeting was brief, a quick brush of her lips on my cheek. She launched immediately into a story about the rehearsal dinner the night before, pointedly excluding me from the details. I let her words wash over me while my eyes took in the room, the glittering crystal chandeliers, the curved staircase wrapped in garlands of white orchids. Dinner passed in a blur of polite conversation and laughter that felt practiced. I was seated at a table toward the back, far from the wedding party. Every now and then, my gaze wandered to the head table where Ethan and Sophie seemed to shoot under the soft lighting, leaning close to whisper to each other between speeches. I focused on the slow swirl of wine in my glass, letting the hum of voices and music dull the edges of my irritation. When the time came for Ethan's toast, the room quieted. He stood tall and confident, raising his champagne. His eyes scanned the crowd, pausing just long enough to make me feel the weight of his stare. "There are so many people here tonight who mean the world to us," he began. "People who have been with us through every step, who belong here sharing this moment." He smiled, letting the silence stretch a beat too long before adding, "And then there are some who maybe don't belong here at all." His gaze locked on mine. The air seemed to thin. A few guests chuckled softly, unsure whether it was a joke. Sophie's smile widened, her fingers curling around Ethan's arm as if to anchor the moment. I kept my face still, my jaw tight, forcing my pulse to steady. My mother stared into her glass. The music started up again before I could decide if I was more angry or embarrassed. The words hung in my head, heavy and deliberate. I felt the knot in my chest tighten as I looked down at the table, my hand resting on the stem of my glass, unmoving. That was when I knew I would not be sitting here much longer. I kept my eyes on the tablecloth, the fine linen blurring as my mind drifted far from the music and chatter. In my head, the room dissolved and I was back in Dallas 10 years ago, the air heavy with the smell of fresh paint and sawdust from my first renovation project. I had just signed the paperwork on a small but promising property, a rundown duplex in Oak Cliff that I believed could be transformed into something special. I had scraped together every cent I could find, taken a risk that felt huge but worth it. Back then, my mother's pride rested almost entirely on Ethan's shoulders. He had just graduated from law school and joined a prestigious firm downtown. Family dinners were filled with her stories about his cases, the partners who admired him, the bright future ahead. When she did speak to me, it was often with that faintly puzzled tone, as though she still didn't quite understand why I hadn't chosen something more respectable. My father, James, ever the quiet man, would give me a small smile and a nod across the table, but never stepped in. It was 2 weeks into the renovation when the first cracks in that project appeared. My contractor called me one morning with a voice tight with frustration. Someone had started spreading rumors in the neighborhood that my property was tied up in legal trouble, that the city was planning to condemn the building. Potential investors who had been interested in coming in on the deal suddenly stopped returning my calls. I spent days trying to track the source of the rumors, following vague leads, until one evening I heard the truth from an old high school friend who worked at a local bar. Ethan had been in with a group of his law firm buddies, talking loud enough for half the place to hear. He mentioned my name, the property, and a fabricated story about zoning violations and unpaid liens. He played it off like idle gossip, but in a town that small, it spread fast. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He stood there in his pressed shirt and polished shoes, sipping his drink with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said he was just looking out for me, that I was in over my head, and it was better I got out before I lost more money. The words stung, but what cut deeper was the satisfaction in his voice. Within a month, the deal collapsed. I had to sell the duplex at a loss, watching months of planning and weeks of hard work evaporate. My mother never asked what happened, and when I hinted at Ethan's part in it, she dismissed it with a wave, saying I was being too sensitive. My father met my eyes across the room, his expression unreadable, and then looked away. From that point on, I knew exactly where I stood in this family. I stopped expecting fairness. I stopped looking for their approval. I built my business piece by piece, learning to rely on no one but myself. There were years when the phone calls home became fewer, the visits shorter, until our connection was little more than an obligation. Even so, part of me still showed up when Ethan invited me to milestones. Birthdays, his engagement party, and now his wedding. I told myself it was for my father, who seemed to grow more withdrawn with each passing year. But the truth was more complicated. Maybe I still wanted to believe that someday they would see me for who I had become, not for who they decided I was a decade ago. A burst of laughter from the reception hall snapped me back to the present. The clink of glasses, the murmur of voices, the warm glow of lights against polished wood floors. I could feel the old wound throbbing under the fresh sting of Ethan's toast. My hands tightened around the arms of my chair as I stared at the stage where he now stood with Sophie, posing for photographs, looking every bit the golden couple my mother always imagined. The thought came unbidden but clear as day. I had spent years letting them define the limits of where I belonged. Maybe tonight that would change. ChatGPT deny. It was late last summer when Ava called out of the blue and asked if I had time to meet for coffee in Austin. She was in town visiting friends, she said, and there was something she wanted to talk about in person. Ava had always been one of the few family members I could trust to tell me the truth, even if it was uncomfortable, so I didn't hesitate. We met at a small cafe tucked off South Congress, the kind of place with chipped wooden tables and the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls hanging in the air. She didn't waste much time on small talk. After a few sips of her latte, she leaned forward, her voice low. She said she hated to be the one to tell me, but she thought I needed to know what was being said when I wasn't around. Her eyes darted toward the window before coming back to me. Sophie and Ethan, she explained, had a habit of making me the punchline at gatherings with their friends. It wasn't just a passing comment here or there, it was an ongoing joke. I tried to keep my expression steady, but I could feel the heat rising in my face. Ava reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She hesitated for a second before sliding it across the table. On the screen was a screenshot of a group chat I didn't recognize. Sophie's name was at the top of several messages. She had referred to me as a clingy hanger-on, and in another line written that their wedding didn't need me showing up to ruin the aesthetic. The words sat there in stark black letters, casual but cutting in a way that made my stomach turn. For a moment I just stared at the screen, the clatter of cups behind the counter, the quiet hum of conversation around us. It all seemed far away. I read the messages again, slower this time, as if the meaning might change if I gave it more time. It didn't. I handed the phone back to Ava, trying to keep my voice even. She apologized again, saying she had debated whether to tell me at all. She knew it would hurt, but she couldn't stand the thought of me walking into their wedding thinking everything was fine. I told her I appreciated her honesty, and I meant it, but the gratitude was buried under a swell of anger and something colder. We talked a little longer, mostly about safer topics, but my mind wasn't really in it. I kept replaying those words, hearing Sophie's voice in my head, picturing Ethan laughing along. They had always found ways to belittle me, but seeing it spelled out like that stripped away any chance of pretending it was unintentional. When we stood to leave, Ava hugged me tightly. She told me to think carefully about what I wanted to do with the information. I promised her I would, though I already knew I wouldn't confront them. Not yet. Let them think I was oblivious. Let them keep underestimating me. That night, back in my apartment, I sat at my desk with the city lights flickering beyond the window. I opened a blank document on my laptop, the cursor blinking in the corner, but I didn't start typing. Instead, I thought about the years I had spent biting my tongue about every sideways comment and condescending smile. I thought about the way my mother's eyes lit up when Ethan walked into a room and how they dimmed when she looked at me. I closed the laptop and poured myself a glass of bourbon. The bitterness burned, but it steadied me. I told myself I could endure a little longer. There was no need to respond to petty words with petty actions. If there was going to be a response, it would be one they never saw coming. Outside, a warm breeze carried the sound of distant music from a bar down the street. I sat in the quiet, letting the glass rest heavy in my hand, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be about defending my place in their lives. It would be about redefining it entirely. It was a damp February evening in Houston when I walked into the downtown gala. The air smelled faintly of rain and expensive perfume, the kind that lingers in the corners of a crowded room. The event was a fundraiser for an arts program, something I had been invited to through a colleague, and I had no real expectations beyond shaking a few hands and making an appearance. About an hour in, while standing near the silent auction tables, I heard a warm voice call my name. I turned to see Olivia Harper, a woman I'd met briefly years ago at another charity event. She was dressed in a deep emerald gown that made her silver hair almost glow, and she had the kind of posture that suggested she had built something from nothing and fought to keep it. We found ourselves at a quiet table in the corner with glasses of wine in hand. At first we talked about the usual things, real estate trends, local politics, mutual acquaintances. But then her expression shifted, her smile softening into something more thoughtful. She said she had heard I was doing well with my architectural consulting and investments. I told her business had been steady, which was true, though I could tell she wasn't making small talk anymore. She told me about the Willow Estate, the wedding venue she had owned for over 20 years. I had been there before for a client's reception, and I remembered the sprawling gardens and white-pillared veranda. It was the kind of place that looked timeless in photographs. But as she spoke, I could hear the strain behind her words. She admitted the venue had been hit hard over the last year. A sleek new competitor had opened just 15 minutes away, drawing away high-budget clients. On top of that, there was an ongoing lawsuit from a catering supplier over a disputed contract. Then she mentioned the real problem. The bank had been pressuring her over loan payments, and she didn't have the kind of liquidity to weather another bad season. Her voice stayed calm, but I could see her hands curl slightly around her glass. She said that if the right person came along with $1 million and a quick timeline, she would walk away from the business entirely. The number hung in the air between us. $1 million for a property and brand like the Willow Estate was below market value, even factoring in the current issues. I could feel my mind working through the possibilities before I even realized I was doing it. If the property could be stabilized and the bookings recovered, it could be worth twice that in a few years. More than that, owning the place would put me in a position I had never considered before, one where I controlled the setting of certain moments, the kind of moments that left impressions. Olivia laughed softly, almost apologetically, and said she hadn't meant to turn the evening into a business pitch. She was just tired, she said, and needed to be honest about where she stood. I told her I appreciated her candor and that I would think about what she'd said. She didn't press the matter, and soon she was pulled away by another guest. For the rest of the evening, I found myself watching her from across the room, noting how people greeted her, how she seemed both respected and a little distant. I wondered if she felt the same isolation I sometimes did in rooms like this. On the drive home, the city lights smeared in the rain on my windshield, I kept running the numbers in my head. I thought about the property, about the fact that it was Ethan's chosen venue for the wedding, about the irony of it all. The idea started small, a quiet thought in the back of my mind. But with each mile, it grew sharper. By the time I pulled into my garage, I knew I would at least explore the possibility. I had the means, I had the contacts, and now I had a reason. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen island staring at my phone. I still had Olivia's number from years ago. It would be easy to send a message, something casual, to set up a meeting. I decided to wait until morning. Some things were better done in daylight with a clear head. That night, sleep came slowly. My thoughts kept circling back to the gardens at the Willow Estate, the sound of gravel underfoot, the way the main hall caught the light in the late afternoon. I thought about Olivia's voice, steady, but edged with resignation, and about what it would feel like to walk into that place not as a guest, but as the owner. ChatGPT deny. The next morning, I called Caleb before I even made coffee. He was my oldest friend, the one person I trusted to see the full picture without jumping to judgment. When I told him about Olivia's situation and the asking price, he let out a low whistle and said he needed the full set of financials before he could give me his thoughts. He agreed to loop in Harper, a real estate attorney he had worked with for years. Someone who knew how to move fast when the right deal came along. 2 days later, I was sitting in Harper's downtown Austin office, a folder of documents spread across her desk. She flipped through the pages with sharp, practiced eyes, occasionally tapping a pen against her notepad. Olivia had been truthful. The bank pressure was real, the supplier lawsuit was ongoing but minor, and the property's market value was easily double the asking price in a stable market. Harper leaned back in her chair and told me that if I wanted it, she could set up a contract with contingencies that gave me the upper hand. As she outlined the steps, Caleb sat across from me, his hands folded. He asked if I was looking at this purely as an investment or if there was more to it. I didn't answer directly, but the corner of his mouth twitched like he knew the truth already. That evening, while going through my calendar, I saw it. A small note from my mother's email weeks earlier confirming Ethan and Sophie's wedding date and location. September 14th. The Willow Estate. I sat back in my chair staring at the words. There was no denying the poetic symmetry of it. If the timing worked, the ownership could change hands the same day as the wedding. I called Harper the next morning and told her I wanted to proceed, but quietly. No announcements, no public records filings until the last possible moment. She suggested a 2-stage agreement with a sizable deposit to secure the property and a closing date set for mid-September. I wired the deposit that afternoon. Over the next month, Harper coordinated with Olivia's lawyer to finalize the purchase terms. I visited the venue twice under the guise of evaluating the property's renovation potential. The staff greeted me warmly, not realizing I was a prospective owner. I walked the gardens, the main hall, the bridal suite, picturing it all under my name. Caleb handled the background checks on the legal matters, confirming that the lawsuit posed no real risk. He also found that Olivia had kept the property free of structural liens, which meant a clean transfer. Every piece was falling into place. One humid afternoon in late July, Harper called me while I was reviewing blueprints for another project. She said she had run the final timeline and confirmed that all filing, signatures, and notarizations could be completed on September 14th. If I was willing to sign and wire the remaining funds that morning, the title would be officially mine by early afternoon. She paused, then added that if I wanted to, I could walk into the wedding reception as the legal owner of the property. The image was so vivid I could almost feel the weight of the keys in my pocket. I didn't say yes immediately. Instead, I told her to prepare everything as if that was the plan and that I would confirm closer to the date. But deep down, I already knew. I spent August balancing my regular work with the quiet preparations for the transfer. There were meetings with my accountant to structure the purchase in a way that protected my other investments, calls with a landscape architect about potential upgrades, and even a discreet conversation with a high-end catering company about future partnerships. No one outside of Harper and Caleb knew the full story. By early September, the contract was ironclad. All that remained was my signature and the final wire. The night before the wedding, I reviewed the documents one last time. Everything was ready. When I closed the folder and set it on my desk, I realized how calm I felt. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about control, about reclaiming a space where I had been told I didn't belong. And in just a few days, that space would be mine. The morning air in Houston carried that heavy warmth that never quite left even in September. I pulled into the long driveway of the Willow Estate just after 9, and the sun spilling over the manicured lawns and the white stone facade glowing against the deep green of the oaks. A valet in a sharp black vest opened my door, greeting me with the polite enthusiasm reserved for wedding guests. I stepped out in a tailored navy suit, sunglasses shielding my eyes from the brightness. Inside, the main hall was already buzzing with caterers moving trays, florists adjusting centerpieces, and staff checking linens. I moved through them with a quiet nod here and there, keeping my distance from the core of the family gathering upstairs in the bridal and groom suites. I spotted Olivia near the far end of the hall, speaking with a florist about arrangements for the entrance arch. When she noticed me, her smile was professional but knowing. We shook hands as if this was just a friendly exchange. I leaned in just enough to say I'd see her and Harper in the small conference room off the west wing at 2 o'clock. She gave the slightest nod and turned back to her flowers. The ceremony wasn't until late afternoon, but already the guests were trickling in. Some I recognized from family gatherings years ago, others I didn't know at all. I kept to the outer edges, watching my presence just enough to be noticed, but never enough to invite a conversation I didn't want. Near the garden doors, Ava appeared, her red hair catching the light. She hugged me briefly, the kind that's warm on the surface but meant to shield something else. She glanced around before leaning in close. Her voice dropped to a whisper low enough that only I could hear. She said Sophie had been on the phone not 20 minutes ago, laughing about how she planned to make sure I regretted showing up. Ava had caught the tail end of it, words about putting me in my place in front of the entire room. I felt my jaw tighten, though I forced a small smile for anyone who might be watching. Ava's eyes searched mine as if deciding whether to say more. I told her quietly to stay close, but not to involve herself if things went sideways. She gave me a small nod and melted back into the crowd. The rest of the morning moved in slow beats. I walked the gardens, stopping to admire the setup as if I were any other guest. The white chairs aligned perfectly under the canopy, the aisle lined with pale roses and eucalyptus. Every detail screamed curated elegance, but underneath it all I could see the faint cracks in the facade, the signs of a venue that had been pushed hard to keep up appearances. I crossed paths with Ethan briefly near the catering prep area. He offered a quick handshake, his eyes scanning me with that same cool detachment I'd felt for years. There was no warmth, no hint that this was his brother standing before him. Just a nod and a tight-lipped smile before he disappeared into a conversation with one of Sophie's relatives. By noon, the sun was higher and the buzz of activity louder. I stepped outside onto the side terrace, needing a moment away from the press of voices. From there, I could see the staff moving like clockwork, trays and flowers passing in an endless loop. My phone buzzed with a message from Harper confirming our meeting time and that all documents were in order. One final signature, one wire, and the property would be mine before the reception even began. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked out over the grounds. Somewhere inside, Sophie was likely perfecting her plan to embarrass me. I let the thought sit without flinching. The stage was set and every piece was exactly where it needed to be. ChatGPT deny. The reception hall was lit with soft amber light, casting a warm glow over the rows of tables dressed in ivory linens and crystal stemware. The low hum of conversation mixed with the gentle notes of the jazz trio playing near the corner. I sat at my assigned table toward the edge of the room, close enough to see the head table but far enough that my absence wouldn't create a scene. Ethan rose from his seat at the center, champagne flute in hand, smiling at Sophie, then sweeping his gaze across the guests. His voice carried easily over the speakers, practiced and confident. He spoke of love, of the journey he and Sophie had taken, and of the people who had supported them. Applause rippled politely after each sentimental line. Then his tone shifted almost imperceptibly as his eyes found mine across the room. He paused just long enough for the silence to settle. He said there were people here tonight who might not feel they belong. A faint chuckle rippled through a few tables. Then he added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes that sometimes it's better when certain people understand their place. The words were clean enough on the surface to pass as a joke, but the intent was sharp as glass. The murmurs began almost instantly, guests exchanging glances, some leaning in to whisper. Sophie's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile, her hand resting lightly over Ethan's on the table. My mother sat still beside them, her face blank, offering neither support nor disapproval. I felt the air shift around me, the kind of tension that makes every sound sharper. I didn't grip my glass tighter or frown or give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I let a small, unreadable smile cross my face. Slowly, I placed my napkin on the table, smoothing it with one hand, before pushing my chair back. The scrape of the chair legs on the polished wood floor was louder than I expected, or maybe the room had simply gone quieter. I stood buttoning my jacket with deliberate calm. My eyes met Ethan's again, and for a moment I thought I saw the flicker of uncertainty there. I nodded once as if acknowledging his toast and turned away. My steps were unhurried as I made my way toward the side exit, passing tables of people pretending not to watch me. I could feel the weight of their eyes, hear the soft rustle of whispered speculation following in my wake. Outside, the cooler evening air hit me, carrying the faint scent of roses from the garden arrangements. The music was muffled here, the laughter and clinking glasses reduced to a distant hum. I walked the stone path toward the west wing, my mind already shifting to the meeting waiting there, to the documents that would change everything before the night was over. The tires crunched over the gravel as the car rolled to a stop near the main entrance. I stepped out, the warm glow from the ballroom spilling onto the stone steps. The faint thump of bass and chatter floated into the night air. I walked toward the double doors, the keys pressing against my palm like a silent reminder of what had just happened. Inside, the reception was in full swing. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the smell of champagne mixed with roasted meat filled the air. I moved through the crowd without touching a single shoulder. Eyes fixed on the stage where the MC was hyping the next round of toasts. I reached the side of the platform and caught the MC's attention with a small gesture. He leaned down, puzzled, and I spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. His eyes widened for a moment, then he straightened and lifted a hand to quiet the band. The music faded, the hum of conversation dimmed, and the sudden silence felt like the air before a storm. I stepped up onto the stage, the microphone cool in my hand. My voice carried easily in the hush. "Thank you for giving me a moment," I said, scanning the crowd. "Tonight is a special night for my brother and his new wife, and for me in a way none of you might expect." Ethan's smile faltered, confusion creeping in. Sophie tilted her head, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth as if she was expecting a punchline at my expense. Rebecca sat stiffly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I let the pause stretch my heartbeat steady now. This venue, the Willow Estate, has been a part of many wonderful celebrations. As of this afternoon, it has a new owner. I reached into my jacket, pulled the keys free, and held them up. The metal caught the light and a ripple went through the crowd. "I am that owner." For a beat, no one spoke. Then the murmur began, low and incredulous. Ethan blinked rapidly, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words coming. Sophie's smirk vanished, her jaw tightening. Rebecca shook her head slowly, like she was trying to process a language she didn't understand. I went on, my tone measured. "So when I say I'm glad to be here tonight, it's not just as a guest. This place is my responsibility now. Every table, every glass, every brick." The silence had weight. Eyes darted between me and Ethan. Someone in the back gave a low whistle that quickly died. Ethan finally found his voice. "This isn't... What are you talking about, Dan?" His laugh was thin, brittle. "You can't just walk in here and say I can," I said evenly. "The papers are signed. The deal is closed. Ask Olivia if you want proof. She's right there." Heads turned toward the far corner where Olivia stood, calm and unreadable. She gave a single nod. Sophie's eyes narrowed, a flush creeping up her neck. "So what, you're trying to make this about you? On our wedding day?" "No," I said, holding her gaze. "I'm just making sure everyone knows where they are tonight." The room stayed still, the weight of the moment pressing down on every table. I handed the microphone back to the MC and stepped down from the stage, the keys still in my hand, their weight now strangely light. I walked past Ethan without looking at him, past Sophie's glare, past my mother's stunned silence, and made my way toward the back terrace where the night air waited cool and steady. The terrace stretched out under strings of warm lights, the faint hum of the party inside seeping through the glass doors. I took a slow breath, the cool night air cutting through the tension still buzzing under my skin. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Caleb. "You done?" he asked when I answered. "Not quite," I said. "There's one more thing." I walked back inside, weaving through the crowd with a calmness I didn't entirely feel. The music had started again, but the mood was off. Conversations were quieter. Eyes followed me as I made my way to the event coordinator's desk tucked behind the bar. Melissa, the coordinator, straightened when she saw me. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "What can I do for you?" "Pull up the contract for tonight's wedding," I told her. "The one Ethan Carter and Sophie Marks signed." She hesitated for only a second before clicking through her laptop. "Here it is." I scanned the document quickly, already familiar with the layout. There were lines about discounted rates for family, waived overtime fees, complimentary premium bar upgrades. I pointed to them one by one. "Remove these. All of them." She glanced up, effective immediately. "Yes. Keep the space open, keep the service going, but the bill will reflect the full cost." She typed without comment, her professionalism a mask over the flicker of surprise in her eyes. The new total appeared on the screen, nearly doubling the original amount. I printed it and folded the paper once. As I turned to leave, a man in a gray suit with a press badge clipped to his lapel caught my eye. He was leaning against the bar, his phone angled discreetly toward me. Our eyes met for a split second. I gave him a polite nod and kept walking. Back in the main hall, I found Ethan near the dessert table, Sophie at his side. I held out the folded paper. "This is the updated invoice," I said evenly. "Payment will be due at the end of the night." Ethan frowned, glancing at it without taking it. "We had a contract, Dan." "You did," I replied. "As the new owner, I have the right to void special terms not yet fulfilled. The venue is still yours for the evening free of charge, but every extra you ordered, that's at market rate." Sophie snatched the paper from my hand, scanning it quickly. Her voice rose. "This is ridiculous. You can't just—" I said, cutting her off. "It's all within the law." People nearby had stopped mid-bite, their eyes darting between us. The murmur began again, low and sharp. Somewhere in the corner I saw the man with the press badge lift his phone a little higher. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're making a scene." "No," I said, my voice calm. "I'm setting terms." "Something you've done to me plenty of times before." Sophie's face flushed deep red. She crumpled the paper in her hand, but the sound was loud enough to draw more attention. A few guests whispered, some shaking their heads. Others smirked like they were enjoying the show. I turned to leave before they could spit back another insult. Behind me, I heard Sophie hiss something to Ethan, her voice sharp and brittle. By the time I reached the terrace again, the man with the press badge was standing there. He smiled faintly. "That's quite a headline you just wrote for yourself, Mr. Carter." I shrugged, leaning on the railing. "Just making sure the truth comes out," I said. His smile widened. "Trust me, it will." The music swelled again inside, but the sound no longer reached me the same way. The night felt different now, heavier and lighter all at once. The game had shifted, and everyone in that ballroom knew it. ChatGPT, done I? By the following Friday, my phone was buzzing from the moment I woke up. News alerts, tagged posts, emails from people I hadn't heard from in years. A video from the wedding had gone viral, clipped from someone's phone and posted with the caption, "Groom's brother drops a $1 bombshell mid-reception." By the afternoon, it had been picked up by 3 local news stations and a national morning show. Everywhere I looked, the comments poured in. Some called me petty. More called it justice. A few even sent me messages about how it gave them the courage to walk away from toxic family dynamics. I didn't respond, but I read every word. Ethan, on the other hand, had gone quiet. A friend in the legal community forwarded me an email thread where a firm withdrew their partnership offer with him citing professional image concerns. Sophie's name was trending for the wrong reasons. A high-profile event planning company had publicly cut ties with her, stating they did not condone public humiliation of clients' guests. On Sunday morning, my mother called. Her voice was softer than I remembered, but still careful. "I heard about the situation," she said. "I thought maybe we could have lunch." I agreed, though I could tell she was testing the waters more than extending an olive branch. We met at a cafe downtown. She asked how I'd been, if business was good, and if I was happy with the venue. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, but she listened. That was more than she'd done in years. That evening, my father stopped by the Willow estate. He walked the grounds with me, taking in the manicured lawns and the soft lights strung between the oaks. "I'm proud of you, Dan," he said quietly. "You did it on your terms." I didn't know how much I needed to hear that until he said it. 2 days later, I opened my inbox to find an email from the National Real Estate Strategies Conference. They'd seen the coverage they wrote and wanted me to speak on the opening day about property investment leverage and knowing your worth. I stared at the screen for a moment before replying yes. The week ended with me standing in the ballroom of the venue I now owned, overseeing a corporate event. The room was full, the air alive with conversation and laughter. I thought about how different it felt from that night, how the same walls could hold such different memories depending on who stood within them. In the quiet after the event, I stood near the grand windows looking out over the lawn. The city lights were distant, the air cool against the glass. My phone vibrated in my pocket again, but this time I didn't check it right away. I just let the silence settle in, knowing the story wasn't over yet. The next morning, I was in my office in Austin, the sun slanting through the tall windows, warming the blueprints spread out across my desk. The lines and measurements formed the skeleton of my next project, a mixed-use development on the east side of the city. It was the kind of challenge that made my mind hum with possibility. I leaned back in my chair, letting the hum of distant traffic fade behind the steady rhythm of my thoughts. My eyes drifted to a framed photo on the bookshelf. It was from years ago, back when Ethan and I were kids, both grinning in front of our parents' old house. I remembered how I used to think that closeness was unshakable. Somewhere along the way, the cracks had formed. Maybe they had always been there. I had spent years trying to patch them, to stand in the same room and feel like I belonged. But belonging had nothing to do with their approval. It came from the work I put in, the risks I took, and the way I carried myself through the setbacks. I thought about that night at the Willow estate, about the moment Ethan's words hung in the air like a verdict. I had not raised my voice or fired back. I had simply chosen to let my actions speak. The deal had been in motion for months, but the timing was perfect. Not because I wanted to humiliate him, but because I was done letting someone else set my worth. There was a knock at the door. My assistant Clara stepped in with a fresh stack of documents for the city permit. She placed them on the desk, her eyes catching the corner of the blueprint. "Looks like it's going to be a big one," she said. I smiled and told her it would be, and that it would be done right. She left, and the quiet filled the room again. I stood walking to the window, the city skyline sharp against the clear autumn sky. In a few weeks, I would be on stage at the real estate conference, speaking to hundreds about strategy, resilience, and knowing when to make your move. It struck me that the story everyone wanted to hear was not about the wedding or the $1 million venue. It was about claiming space in a world that sometimes tries to shut you out. That thought settled in my chest like a steady beat. Revenge was never the point. It was the byproduct of proving to myself more than anyone else that I could stand exactly where I wanted to be and know I had earned it. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. You do not have to raise your voice to be heard. You do not have to seek permission to belong. Sometimes the best revenge is to build something so solid, so unshakable that the people who once doubted you have no choice but to see you for who you really are. And if you are still in the middle of your own battle, keep your head clear, your moves calculated, and your focus on the life you are building. The rest will take care of itself. If you want more stories like this, stay connected here. There is always another chapter worth telling, and you never know when the next move might be yours.